Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. As you saw in the title, today I'm going to be talking about the future of New York City, including real estate, of course, since that's what I do here. I know that everyone across the globe is dealing with the recent issues surrounding the coronavirus pandemic, as well as the social injustice that's being brought to light. But for the purpose of this video, I just want to keep it local to where I live and work. As many of you already know, New York City was one of the hardest hit cities by the coronavirus. Over 200,000 people were infected by the virus and over 20,000 people died from it. In addition to many people losing their lives, the shutdown that we had also caused a major economic slowdown. The unemployment rate here in the city is hovering around 20%, so a little over 1.5 million people are without jobs. 3,000 small businesses have permanently closed, and the ones that are still opening are experiencing a huge drop in revenue. The real estate market took a big hit. Actually, in the second quarter of this year, there were $2.3 billion in commercial real estate sales. That's 68% lower than the first quarter of this year and 77% lower than the second quarter of last year. In addition, with the apartments, there's over 20,000 vacant apartments on the market in Manhattan alone. And at least 75% of those apartments have concessions on them where the landlord is paying the broker fee instead of the tenant, or they're given a month or 2 months, even sometimes free in rent, or even doing a combination of both of those. Not only have we been dealing with an economic slowdown that's been caused by the coronavirus, but we're also dealing with an increase in crime. I think this is for a couple of reasons. I think one is because of the social injustice that has been recently brought to light. People are losing respect for cops and the justice system. But I also think that with less people being on the street, some think that they can get away with crime right now. There are also government policies that have been put in place that have been having a negative impact on the economy. One of those being the bail reform, which was passed earlier this year, and then the other being the new rent laws that passed last June, which I actually want to talk about those rent laws for those of you who don't realize how bad they actually are. Rent-stabilized apartments in New York City are usually found in buildings that were built before 1974 and have at least 6 apartments. The rents in these apartments are usually well below market rent, and the increases that you can get on them are governed by a city board called the Rent Guidelines Board. The Rent Guidelines Board meets every year, every June, and they decide how much landlords of rent-stabilized apartments can raise those rents. They usually range between 1% and 3%, but sometimes they freeze the rents so you can't raise them at all. The purpose of this is to provide affordable housing in New York City, which I'm all for affordable housing. You know, I think that everyone deserves to live in a place in New York City. The thing is, most of these apartments that are rent stabilized, they're not in good condition. They're in buildings that are undermanaged. Even the common spaces in the buildings, they need work. So what landlords do, they buy these buildings and they renovate them. Before the rent laws passed last June, landlords were able to pass on a portion of this cost to their tenants in a form of a rent increase. Landlords were able to raise their rents based on how much money they spent on renovating the units and the building. One of the goals of raising the rent was to get past the threshold that you needed to pass in order to destabilize the unit. The reason landlords want to pass that threshold and destabilize an apartment is because you want to be able to charge what the market will take. And you also don't want your increases being governed by the city. It's important for landlords to be able to do this, to not only provide nicer housing for tenants, but also for them to just be able to afford to keep their buildings. It's really expensive to run a building in New York City. Taxes alone, real estate taxes, on a lot of these small apartment buildings in the city, the annual bill is 6 figures. It's over $100,000 a year. So they have to be able to pay that. They have to be able to pay for the upkeep and the maintenance of the buildings, the utilities, and most landlords, they also have a mortgage. These buildings aren't cheap, so they have to cover these big mortgage payments. So all of this put together, all of their expenses, if they're going up every year, they have to be able to increase their rents every year to keep up with them. And since those new rent laws passed last year, a lot of landlords, especially the smaller landlords, they're at a big risk of losing their buildings. And if they lose their buildings, they're gonna lose them to a large real estate firm or a large private equity firm. That's an unintended consequence of these laws, but that's what will happen if something doesn't change with them. But enough of that. I could go on and on about, rent stabilization in New York City and the rent laws, but this video isn't for that. I'll save that for another video. So let me continue on with where I see New York City going post-COVID. It's not all bad news. I know a lot of people have left the city once COVID started to go to the suburbs, but I think that's only temporary. Only 10% of companies in Manhattan have reopened their offices for people to physically show back up. Many other companies are still allowing their workers to work from home. So if they're doing that, a lot of them feel like they can go to the suburbs and they can get more for their money. So they're gonna do that temporarily. The other thing is schools are still closed. They're gonna be opening soon, but right now there's no school. Some of the colleges, a lot of the students don't know if they're gonna be physically going back to class or doing their classes online. So there's still a lot of uncertainty around that, but some people are still coming back anyway. I met a few NYU students who, even though they're doing their classes online, they still want to be in New York City and they're looking for apartments here. So you'll see that happening whether schools open or not. But if the schools open back up, you'll really see an uptick in people coming back to the city, families coming back for, their kids to go to school, and students coming back to go to college. And with offices opening back up, people are gonna miss being close to their office and not commuting in from the suburbs with those long commutes. And they'll come back as well. I'm not saying that all of this is gonna happen like that, but it's gonna happen eventually. I think next summer, early to middle of next year, we're gonna see a big improvement, and then towards the end of the year, a major improvement, and then increasing from there. A lot of what New York City has to offer, including Broadway shows, museums, some of the shopping, a lot of that is still closed. But once that opens back up and we have a vaccine, people are gonna be missing the city life and missing being able to do and take advantage of all this stuff. So this exodus that everyone is talking about, that's temporary. People will be back and the city will recover. The last thing that I want to talk about is the silver lining to the pandemic. I know it's devastating how many people got sick, lost their lives, lost their jobs, and lost a lot of money. But always try to stay positive and see the good in things. For those of you who live and work in the city or in the area, do you remember pre-COVID, before all this happened, your commute? How crazy packed it was on the trains and on the buses, and when driving in, how much traffic there was, and even walking was a nightmare sometimes with so many people crammed on the sidewalks between people trying to get to work and even tourists. Now you don't have that. It's so much easier and quicker commuting right now around the city. Personally, I'm able to get from my garage to appointments in the West Village in Soho, where most of my appointments are, in less than 10 minutes. That's really nice. Also, going for walks if you just want to take a nice stroll down a New York City street. It's not packed with people. It's a lot more peaceful. And dining, that is a huge one. Do you remember pre-COVID when you would go out to eat? You're pretty much eating with your neighbors because their tables are right next to yours. New York City restaurant owners, that's what they do. Understandably, you want to fit as many people as you can into these small spaces. But now, of course, we're not eating inside. We have outdoor dining, but we have more space too. The tables are distanced. You can actually have a private conversation and you have more room to move around. So that's another nice thing. Lastly, I know that a lot of people took advantage of this time to get closer to family and even tackle some of the things that they didn't have time to do before because, of their commute and being in the office. So I think with the stay-at-home orders, a lot of people actually benefited from that, from staying home and getting closer to their families and doing these other things that they weren't able to do before. Those were a few of the silver linings that I found. And again, I know how devastating the effects of the virus were. Like I always say, I think it's important to try to stay positive at all times, or as much as you can. So that was the positivity that I found around that. With all that said, New York City will recover, including the real estate market. Think about all the good things that happened over the past decade since the 2008 slowdown. I think that the recovery and expansion after this slowdown will be similar to that. One difference between them, though, is that in this one, there's a lot more capital sitting on the sidelines. And for those of you who take advantage of this time and take a bet on the long-term growth of the city, I think you'll be happy you did. I still believe this is the best city in the world, one of the most resilient, and it'll always recover from adversity. All right, so that's it for this video. Let me know in the comments what you thought, whether you agree or disagree. I want to hear your thoughts. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more, and I'll see you in the next one.